They were twin sisters with matching dog tags and broken dreams. He was a single father who traded his uniform for an apron, running a small-town cafe where secrets were shared over coffee. On a rain-soaked evening, their worlds collided not through chance, but through a whispered confession that shattered the silence. We failed our mission. We failed everyone. What Elias Trenwick discovered next would uncover a truth so devastating, yet so deeply human, it would transform 3 shattered lives forever. This isn't just a story about failure. It's a story about redemption, about how hope can resurface in the darkest moments, and how sometimes the people who save us are the ones who understand our pain the deepest. If stories like this touch your soul, we invite you to journey with us. Like, share, and subscribe to Soul Moment Story for more powerful tales that remind us the most broken among us often become the greatest healers. And now, let the story begin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the windows of Ember's End Cafe like impatient fingers, each drop creating rivulets that distorted the streetlights of Millhaven into abstract watercolor smears. Inside, the warmth embraced anyone who dared venture through the heavy oak door, carrying with it the rich aroma of roasted coffee beans and fresh-baked apple turnovers that had become Elias Trenwick's signature. At 42, Elias moved through his cafe with the precision of a man who had learned to find peace in routine. His broad shoulders carried the memory of body armor, though now they bore only a flour-dusted apron tied around his waist. The scar that traced from his left temple to his jawline had faded over the years, but it remained a permanent reminder of the roadside bomb in Kandahar that had ended his military career and changed the trajectory of his life forever. His 17-year-old son, Noah, sat at the corner table, textbooks spread before him like battle plans, his brow furrowed in concentration as he wrestled with calculus problems. The boy had his mother's gentle eyes and stubborn determination, traits that both comforted and worried Elias daily. Sarah had been gone for 3 years now, taken by cancer that moved through her body with the same ruthless efficiency that Elias had once brought to tactical operations. The cafe had become their sanctuary, a place where Elias could provide for his son while staying close enough to supervise homework, offer guidance, and maintain the stability that Noah desperately needed. The regulars had become their extended family. Mrs. Hendricks, who came for her Earl Grey at precisely 2 p.m. every Tuesday. Old Pete, who shared war stories over black coffee and never let Elias pay for his own pastries, and the Thursday Night Book Club that had somehow adopted both Trenwick men as honorary members, despite neither having read a novel in years. But tonight was different. The cafe should have been empty by now, close to the world as Elias prepared the next day's inventory. And Noah finished his studies. Instead, 2 figures sat huddled in the booth furthest from the window, their conversation barely audible above the rain's percussion against glass and the gentle hum of the espresso machine cooling down. Elias had noticed them immediately when they'd entered 20 minutes earlier. Military bearing was something you never forgot how to recognize, even when it came wrapped in civilian clothes that hung loose and uncomfortable on frames accustomed to pressed uniforms. The twin sisters had identical postures, shoulders squared. Despite their obvious exhaustion, chins raised in defiance of whatever storm they were weathering internally. Celine and Clara. They'd introduced themselves when ordering coffee. No last names, no small talk. Just a quiet request for whatever's strongest and a booth in the back corner where shadows could provide cover. They looked to be in their late 20s, with the kind of tan that spoke of desert deployments and the 1,000-yard stare that Elias recognized from his own mirror on difficult mornings. Their resemblance was striking, yet subtle. Clara wore her dark hair in a practical ponytail, revealing the tension in her neck and shoulders, while Celine's was cropped shorter, military regulation length, that she probably hadn't bothered to grow out since discharge. Both had the lean build of soldiers who had spent years carrying heavy packs across hostile terrain, and both wore long sleeves despite the cafe's warmth, hiding whatever stories their skin might tell. Elias had given them space, retreating to his usual post-closing routine of cleaning equipment and organizing supplies for the morning rush. But he kept one ear tuned to their conversation, not from nosiness, but from the instinct that had kept him alive through 2 combat tours. Something in their voices carried the weight of people teetering on an edge, and he'd learned long ago that ignoring such signals often led to regret. Noah looked up from his textbook, pencil tapping against his lip in the same rhythm his mother used to employ when thinking. "Dad, did you know those ladies are soldiers? What makes you say that?" Elias asked, though he'd reached the same conclusion within seconds of their arrival. "The way they sit, the way they check exits when they think no one's looking. Plus, Clara has a unit tattoo on her wrist. I saw it when she reached for the sugar." Noah's observation skills had sharpened considerably since his mother's death, as if losing one parent had made him hyper-vigilant about reading the adults around him. Elias nodded, proud of his son's awareness while simultaneously worried about what experiences had taught him to be so observant. Sometimes people carry their training with them longer than they carry their uniforms. "Like you?" The question hit harder than expected. Elias paused in his wiping of the counter, considering his response. "Yeah, like me." The sisters' voices had dropped to whispers now, their conversation taking on the urgent quality of people working through a crisis. Elias caught fragments. "Command won't listen. 36 hours. No other options left." But it was Clara's next words that made him freeze, dish rag clutched in his white-knuckled grip. "We failed our mission, Selene. We failed everyone who trusted us." The pain in her voice was raw, unfiltered, the kind of anguish that could only come from people who had sworn an oath to protect others and believed they had broken that sacred trust. It was a tone Elias knew intimately, having heard it in his own voice during the long nights after his discharge, when phantom limb pain from his injured leg kept him awake and phantom guilt from his lost unit kept his mind racing. Selene's response came barely above a whisper. 36 people. Clara, 36 families who trusted us to bring their people home safely. And we couldn't even. Her voice broke, and the sound hit Elias like physical force. He'd been there, in that space where professional duty collided with human limitations, where the weight of other people's lives pressed down until breathing became a conscious effort rather than an automatic function. Noah had stopped pretending to study, his young face etched with concern as he watched his father's reaction to the overheard conversation. The boy had developed an uncanny ability to read emotional undercurrents, a skill born from months of managing his own grief while supporting a parent struggling with loss and transition. "Dad?" Noah's voice carried the careful tone of someone testing dangerous waters. But Elias was already moving, his body responding to a call that bypassed conscious thought. These women were drowning in the same dark waters that had nearly claimed him 3 years ago, when the combination of physical injury, survivor's guilt, and sudden single parenthood had pushed him to the brink of making decisions that would have left Noah orphaned. He approached their table slowly, respectfully, hands visible and movements deliberate in the way that combat veterans learned to telegraph peaceful intentions to people whose nerves had been scraped raw by experience. "Excuse me," he said softly, voice pitched to carry warmth without intrusion. "I couldn't help but notice you both look like you could use something stronger than coffee." Both women tensed immediately, years of training bringing them to alertness. Despite their emotional exhaustion, Clara's hand moved instinctively toward her hip, where muscle memory expected to find a sidearm that wasn't there. Selene's eyes swept the room, cataloging exits and potential threats with the efficiency of someone whose life had once depended on such assessments. "We're fine," Clara said automatically, the response as practiced as a drill movement. "Just having a conversation. I know, Elias replied gently, pulling out his phone and showing them a photo of himself in desert camouflage, arms slung around two other soldiers against a backdrop of endless sand and relentless sun. I also know what it sounds like when people who've served together are trying to carry something too heavy for just two sets of shoulders. The sisters exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that twins and battle-tested partners developed over years of shared experience. In that glance, Elias saw recognition, evaluation, and the desperate hope of people who had been carrying their burden in isolation for far too long. You were deployed? Selene asked, her voice carefully. Neutral. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Came home in 2019 with a Purple Heart, a medical discharge, and more questions than answers about what comes next. He gestured toward Noah, who was watching the interaction with the intensity of someone whose world had been built on the foundation of his father's choices, then figuring it out one day at a time ever since. The rain continued its assault against the windows, but inside the cafe, something had shifted. 3 veterans sat in a pool of warm light, separated by different wars and different wounds, but connected by the invisible threads that bound people who had sworn the same oaths and carried the same burdens. And in that moment, Elias Trenwick made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither side was sure they wanted to cross. Elias remained standing beside their booth, giving them space to decide while making it clear he wasn't going anywhere unless they asked him to leave. Behind him, Noah had closed his textbook and was watching the interaction with the quiet intensity of someone who had learned to read the emotional weather patterns that governed his small family's world. Clara's eyes never left Elias's face, searching for signs of deception or hidden agenda. Her twin sister Selene had adopted a different strategy, staring down at her coffee cup, as if the dark liquid might contain answers to questions she wasn't ready to voice. Both women bore the invisible scars of people who had learned the hard way that trust was a luxury they could rarely afford. "What makes you think we need help?" Clara asked finally, her tone carrying the edge that came from months of having their concerns dismissed by people who should have listened. Elias lowered himself into the booth across from them, moving slowly to avoid triggering defensive instincts. "Because 3 months ago, I was sitting in this same booth at 2 a.m., staring at a bottle of pills and trying to convince myself that my son would be better off without me." His voice carried no self-pity, just the flat honesty of someone who had walked to the edge of a cliff and somehow found the strength to step back. The admission hit the air like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of recognition across both women's faces. Selene looked up for the first time since he'd sat down, her eyes reflecting a pain so profound it seemed to have its own gravitational pull. "What stopped you?" she asked, the question emerging from some deep place where professional armor couldn't reach. "Him," Elias said simply, nodding toward Noah. And the realization that the voice in my head telling me I was a failure wasn't my voice at all. It was the voice of every system that had failed me, every person who had looked at my injuries and seeing weakness instead of sacrifice, every bureaucrat who had treated my service like a liability instead of an asset. Clara leaned forward slightly, the first crack in her defensive posture. "You said you had questions when you came home. Did you find answers?" "Some. Others I'm still working on." Elias signaled to Noah, who approached carrying 3 fresh mugs and a plate of the apple turnovers that had been cooling on the counter. The boy moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to read social situations and respond appropriately, setting down the offerings without being asked and retreating to give the adults space to continue their conversation. "Smart kid," Selene observed, accepting the warmth of the mug between her palms like a benediction. "Smarter than his old man most days." He's the one who convinced me to buy this place instead of drinking myself to death in some apartment across town." Elias took a sip of coffee, buying time to choose his next words carefully. "Sometimes the people who save us are the ones we're supposed to be protecting." The comment landed with unexpected force. Clara's composure cracked visibly, her hand trembling as she reached for her own mug. Selene closed her eyes as if trying to shut out some internal voice that had been tormenting her for far too long. "You don't know what we've done," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I don't. But I know what it feels like to believe you failed people who trusted you. I know what it's like to replay every decision, every split-second choice, wondering if there was some combination of actions that would have changed everything." Elias leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. "I also know what it's like to realize that the standards we hold ourselves to are often impossible for any human being to meet." Outside, the rain had intensified, turning the world beyond the cafe windows into an impressionist painting of blurred lights and indistinct shapes. Inside, the overhead lights created a warm cocoon that seemed separate from the storm, a pocket of safety in a world that had proven itself capable of sudden violence and inexplicable loss. Noah had returned to his homework, but was clearly listening to every word, his young face reflecting the same protective instincts that drove his father to reach out to strangers in pain. The boy had seen his own parents struggle with demons born from service and sacrifice, and had learned that healing often required community rather than isolation. "We were private contractors," Selene said suddenly, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Security consultants for humanitarian aid organizations. Our job was to keep people safe while they did impossible work in impossible places." Clara shot her sister a warning look, but Selene continued as if driven by forces beyond her control. "We were good at it. 10 years, dozens of missions. Hundreds of people brought home safely to their families. Until 3 weeks ago," Clara added, her voice hollow. The sisters exchanged another look, this one heavy with shared trauma and mutual blame. Elias recognized the dynamic immediately. Partners who had survived something terrible together, but couldn't yet forgive themselves enough to forgive each other. "What happened?" he asked gently. "Extraction mission in Somalia. Medical team had been trapped for 36 hours in a compound surrounded by hostile forces. Our job was to get them out." Selene's voice had taken on the mechanical quality of someone reciting facts to avoid feeling emotions. "We had intelligence, we had a plan, we had backup support. Everything looked solid. But intelligence was wrong," Clara continued. "The backup support never materialized. And our plan got 36 good people killed." The number hung in the air like an accusation. 36 lives, 36 families, 36 futures snuffed out because 2 women who had dedicated their lives to protecting others had made decisions that led to tragedy instead of salvation. "You were there?" Elias asked. "We were supposed to be. We were the advance team, meant to secure the perimeter before the extraction helicopters arrived." Clara's hands were shaking now, coffee sloshing against the sides of her mug. "But our transport broke down 15 kilometers from the target. By the time we reached the compound, it was already too late. The medical team had tried to break out on their own when they heard the helicopters approaching. They thought we were already in position to provide cover." Selene's voice cracked. "Instead, they ran into a crossfire with no support, no protection. No chance." The weight of their confession settled over the table like a physical presence. Elias could see the exhaustion in their faces, the way their bodies seemed to fold inward under the pressure of carrying such devastating knowledge. These were women who had built their identities on their ability to protect others, and that identity had been shattered by circumstances beyond their control. "Have you eaten today?" Elias asked, the question seemingly coming from nowhere. Women looked at him in surprise. "What? Food? When was the last time either of you had a real meal?" He was already standing, moving toward the kitchen area behind the counter. Because trauma has a way of making people forget basic human needs, and you can't think clearly if your blood sugar is in free fall. Noah looked up from his homework, recognizing the pattern. His father had learned long ago that sometimes the most profound healing began with the simplest acts of care: a warm meal, a safe place to sit, someone willing to listen without judgment. "We should go," Clara said, but made no move to leave the booth. "You could." "But it's pouring rain. You've been carrying something heavy for weeks by yourselves, and I make a decent grilled cheese sandwich." Elias was already pulling ingredients from the refrigerator, his movements efficient and purposeful. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stay put long enough for the storm to pass. Selene looked toward the windows, where rain continued to sheet down in torrents that made the outside world seem impossibly distant. When she turned back, there were tears in her eyes that she didn't bother to hide. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know us." Elias paused in his sandwich preparation, considering the question seriously. "Because 3 months ago, a stranger in this same booth convinced me to stay alive long enough to figure out what came next. Sometimes paying it forward is the only way to make sense of being saved." The sound of butter sizzling in the pan filled the comfortable silence that followed. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cafe, something fragile and hopeful had begun to take root. The grilled cheese sandwiches emerged from the pan golden and perfect, the cheese oozing slightly at the edges in a way that spoke of comfort food mastered through repetition. Elias had learned the art of the perfect grilled cheese during the long months after Sarah's death, when Noah's appetite had disappeared along with his mother, and coaxing him to eat had become a daily battle, requiring creativity and patience. He set the plates down along with small bowls of tomato soup that had been simmering quietly on the back burner, filling the cafe with an aroma that suggested safety and sustenance. The simple meal looked almost absurdly normal against the backdrop of the conversation they'd been having. But sometimes normal was exactly what traumatized souls needed most. "I haven't had a grilled cheese sandwich since I was 12, Clara admitted, picking up one triangle and examining it as if it might contain hidden meaning. "My mom used to make them when Selena and I got suspended from school," she continued, taking a tentative bite. The first taste seemed to unlock something in her face, a softening around the eyes that spoke of memories temporarily overpowering. "Present pain. We got in trouble a lot. Fighting with kids who said mean things about our dad being deployed." Selene smiled for the first time since entering the cafe, the expression transforming her face entirely. "You always threw the first punch. I just back you up." Someone had to stand up for him. He wasn't there to defend himself. Clara's voice carried the fierce loyalty that had probably driven her toward a career protecting others. "Besides, you hit harder than me anyway." The exchange revealed glimpses of who these women had been before trauma reshaped them. Protective sisters who had learned early that the world could be hostile to military families. That strength often meant standing together against forces larger than themselves. That loyalty was measured not in words, but in willingness to share consequences. Noah looked up from his textbook, drawn by the sound of laughter that felt foreign after weeks of tense whispers and haunted silences that had characterized the sisters' arrival. "My dad got in fights at school too. Mom told me about it once." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Your mother had a big mouth. She said you were protecting kids who couldn't protect themselves. She said that's how she knew you were going to be a good soldier and a good dad." Noah's matter-of-fact delivery of this information hit harder than any dramatic declaration could have. The boy had inherited his mother's ability to find exactly the right words to cut through pretense and reach truth. The comment hung in the air, connecting past and present in ways that made all 4 occupants of the cafe suddenly aware of how individual stories could weave together into something larger than their separate parts. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady rhythm against the windows. No longer the violent assault it had been, but now a gentle percussion that made the interior warmth feel even more precious. "What did you do? Before the cafe, I mean?" Selene asked, seeming genuinely curious for the first time since entering. "Military police. Started as regular infantry, but turned out I had a knack for investigation and de-escalation." Elias settled back into his seat, nursing his coffee. "Spent most of my deployment tracking down supply chain corruption and mediating disputes between different units. Not exactly the hero story people expect when they thank me for my service, but important work," Clara observed. "Someone has to make sure the system functions properly." That's what I told myself, right up until the system decided I was expendable. Because a roadside bomb messed up my leg and gave me a traumatic brain injury that made me unreliable for continued service. The bitterness in Elias's voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakably present. Turns out 20 years of exemplary service doesn't count for much when you can't pass a physical fitness test anymore. The parallel between his experience and theirs wasn't lost on anyone at the table. All three had dedicated their lives to serving others, only to discover that the institutions they'd trusted to support them could be just as capable of abandonment as the enemies they'd fought against. "How long were you contractors?" Elias asked. "Since 2018, we left active duty together and started our own company specializing in high-risk extractions." Selene's voice had taken on a professional tone, as if discussing business details was easier than acknowledging the emotional weight of their work. "We were good at it because we could anticipate each other's movements, communicate without words when stealth was required. Being twins helped," Clara added. "Clients trusted us because we had something to lose if either of us made mistakes. Our reputation was built on the idea that we would never leave anyone behind, never accept a mission we couldn't complete successfully." "Until Somalia," Selene said quietly. "Until Somalia," Clara agreed. The acknowledgement sat between them like a bridge they weren't ready to cross. Elias recognized the moment from his own healing journey, the point where admitting the extent of trauma became possible, but processing it still seemed insurmountable. Noah had abandoned all pretense of studying and was listening openly now, his young face reflecting the gravity of adult pain without fully understanding its implications. The boy had learned that sometimes the most helpful thing he could do was simply witness, to be present without trying to fix or minimize or distract. "The transport that broke down," Elias said carefully. "Was it mechanical failure or something else?" The sisters exchanged a look heavy with information they weren't sure they were ready to share. Clara's jaw tightened in the way that suggested internal debate between professional secrecy and desperate need to unburden themselves to someone who might understand. "Equipment failure," she said finally, "but not random equipment failure. Someone had sabotaged our vehicle to delay our arrival at the extraction point. Someone who knew your route, your timeline, your mission parameters," Selene added. "Someone with access to intelligence that should have been compartmentalized." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, betrayal from within their own organization, the possibility that 36 people had died not because of enemy action, but because of deliberate sabotage by people who should have been protecting them. "Have you reported this?" Elias asked. "To who?" "The same people who might have set us up in the first place." Clara's laugh was bitter. "We've been blacklisted from every major contractor organization. Our security clearances have been suspended pending investigation. No one will take our calls, let alone listen to our suspicions about internal sabotage. They're treating us like we're the problem instead of victims of the problem," Selene added. "Like we somehow caused 36 deaths through incompetence, rather than being prevented from stopping them through betrayal." The cafe fell silent except for the continued sound of rain against glass and the quiet hum of equipment settling into evening routines. Elias found himself thinking of his own battles with bureaucracy after his injury. The way systems designed to support veterans could become adversarial when those same veterans needed help navigating complex medical and disability processes. "How long since you've slept?" he asked. Both women looked surprised by the question. "What? Real sleep? Not catnaps in your car or passing out from exhaustion. When did you last sleep somewhere safe for more than 4 hours straight?" They looked at each other, clearly trying to calculate an answer that revealed how far they'd fallen from any semblance of normal life. "Maybe 10 days, Clara admitted. "We've been staying in different motels every night, never the same place twice, paying cash," Selene explained. "If someone set us up once, they might try to finish the job." Elias nodded, recognizing the paranoia that came from having your trust violated by people who were supposed to protect you. "There's an apartment above the cafe. Used to be storage, but I converted it when Noah and I first moved here. It's not fancy, but it's clean and secure, and no one knows about it except us." "We can't," Clara started. "You can," Elias interrupted gently. "You need somewhere safe to regroup. And I need to know that two people who spent years protecting others aren't going to hurt themselves because they couldn't ask for help when they needed it most." Noah looked up from his homework. "The couch pulls out into a bed, and Dad makes really good pancakes for breakfast." The simple offer, delivered by someone too young to fully understand the complexity of adult trauma, but old enough to recognize human need, seemed to cut through their remaining resistance. For the first time since entering the cafe, both sisters looked like they might actually accept help instead of running from it. Outside, the storm continued, but inside, 3 veterans and 1 wise teenager had created something neither training nor experience had taught them to expect: a space where being broken didn't disqualify you from being cared for. The apartment above Ember's End Cafe had been transformed through necessity and Noah's surprising eye for making small spaces feel welcoming. What had once been storage for extra supplies and seasonal decorations now served as a comfortable refuge, complete with a small kitchenette, a bathroom with a shower that actually produced hot water, and a living area furnished with pieces collected from thrift stores and estate sales. The couch Noah had mentioned was indeed a pull-out, though it had seen better decades. 2 mismatched armchairs faced a small television that received 3 channels on clear days, and bookshelves lined one wall, filled with an eclectic mix of military histories, cooking magazines, and the fantasy novels that Sarah had loved and that Elias couldn't bring himself to pack away. "It's not much," Elias said as he showed them upstairs, flicking on lights that revealed the space's modest charm. "But the door locks from the inside. The windows face the back alley where no one can see who's coming or going, and the walls are thick enough that you don't have to worry about anyone overhearing conversations." Clara moved immediately to the windows, checking sight lines and escape routes with the automatic efficiency of someone whose life had depended on such assessments. Selene examined the door lock and tested the strength of the deadbolt, nodding approval at its quality and condition. "When did you install the security system?" Selene asked, noticing the small keypad beside the door. 2 years ago, after someone tried to break into the cafe. Noah was upstairs doing homework when it happened. Elias's voice carried the protective edge that came from any threat to his son's safety. "The system covers both floors, and the panic button connects directly to the local police station." The sisters exchanged one of their wordless communications, and Elias could see them evaluating the space, not just for comfort, but for tactical advantages. They were women who had learned to think in terms of defensive positions and escape routes, and old habits died hard even in safe spaces. There are clean sheets in the closet, towels in the bathroom, and the refrigerator is stocked with basics. Help yourselves to anything you need. He paused at the top of the stairs. "The cafe opens at 6, but I'm usually down there by 5 getting everything ready. If you need anything during the night, Just use the intercom by the door." After he left, the sisters stood in the middle of the small living room, suddenly uncertain how to occupy a space that offered safety without requiring vigilance. It had been so long since either of them had been somewhere they could truly relax that the absence of threat felt almost more unsettling than its presence. "When did we last have our own space?" Clara asked, sinking into one of the armchairs. "The hotel in Dubai, 3 months ago, before the Somalia job." Selene was still examining the room's security features, but her movements had lost some of their urgency. "Remember? You complained about the thread count on the sheets." "They were scratchy," Clara defended, but she was smiling slightly. "And the air conditioning sounded like a helicopter landing on the roof. Everything sounds like helicopters to you. Only the loud things." The exchange was light, almost normal, a glimpse of the relationship that existed beneath layers of trauma and mutual guilt. But it didn't last long before the weight of recent events reasserted itself, drawing both women back into the heavy silence that had characterized their interactions for weeks. Selene finally settled into the other armchair, pulling her knees up to her chest in a posture that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her professional demeanor suggested. "You think he's right about the sabotage being internal? You mean, do I think someone we trusted set us up to fail?" Clara stared at the ceiling, where water stains formed abstract patterns that could have been maps of places they'd never see again. 3 weeks ago, I would have said no. Today, it's the only explanation that makes sense. But who and why? The questions that had been torturing them both since Somalia hung in the air like accusations. Their company, Meridian Security Solutions, had been small but elite, employing fewer than 50 people total. Everyone had been thoroughly vetted, extensively trained, and bound by contracts that made betrayal not just morally reprehensible but financially devastating. "Someone with access to our route planning, our communication protocols, our equipment, maintenance schedules," Clara said, ticking off the requirements on her fingers. "Someone who knew exactly when and how to disable our transport to maximize the delay. Someone who wanted those medical workers dead." Selene added quietly. The implications of that statement settled over them like a cold blanket. If their suspicions were correct, 36 people had died not because of random violence or tactical miscalculation, but because someone had deliberately engineered their deaths and used the Carter sisters as unwitting instruments of that plan. "We need to figure out who and why," Clara said. "With what resources? We're blacklisted, our clearances are suspended, and anyone who might help us thinks we're either incompetent or complicit." Selene's frustration was evident in every word. Plus, if we're right about internal sabotage, investigating could put U.S. in even more danger. Below them, they could hear the quiet sounds of Elias cleaning up the cafe for the night, the familiar domestic noises of someone completing evening routines in a space that had become home through choice rather than assignment. The contrast between his settled life and their current existence as fugitives from their own profession wasn't lost on either sister. "He lost his wife," Clara said suddenly. "I know. But he's not letting it destroy him. He's building something new instead of just surviving." Selene looked at her twin, recognizing the direction of her thoughts. "We can't stay here, Clara. We can't drag them into our mess. I'm not talking about staying. I'm talking about learning." Clara met her sister's eyes. "How do you rebuild when everything you thought you knew turns out to be wrong? How do you trust people when trust got you betrayed? How do you keep going when the thing you were best at becomes the thing that caused the most damage?" The questions were bigger than their immediate circumstances, touching on fundamental issues of identity and purpose that went to the core of who they had been and who they might become. Both women had built their adult lives around being protectors, and now they were the ones who needed protection. A soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. "Come in," Clara called. Noah appeared at the top of the stairs carrying a tray with 2 mugs of hot chocolate and a plate of homemade cookies. Dad thought you might want something before bed. He says sugar helps when your brain won't stop thinking. The simple kindness of the gesture, delivered by someone too young to have ulterior motives, hit both women harder than they expected. When was the last time someone had taken care of them without expecting anything in return? When had they last been in a place where hot chocolate and cookies were the solution to any problem? "Thank you," Celine said, accepting the tray. "That was very thoughtful." Noah lingered at the top of the stairs, clearly wanting to say something, but uncertain whether he should. Finally he spoke. "My mom used to say that sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the things that help us understand other people better. She said that's why Dad is so good at helping people now." The observation, delivered with the unconscious wisdom of someone who had learned profound truths through personal loss, settled over the room like a benediction. Here was a teenager who had lost his mother, but had somehow internalized lessons about finding meaning in suffering rather than just enduring it. "Your mom sounds like she was very wise," Clara said gently. She was. She said Dad would figure out how to help people again, just differently than when he was a soldier. She was. Right. Noah smiled, the expression lighting up his face in a way that revealed how much of his father's strength came from this boy's faith in him. "I think she would have liked you both." After he left, the sisters sat in comfortable silence, sipping hot chocolate that tasted like childhood memories and safety. The questions that had been tormenting them didn't have answers yet, but somehow they seemed less overwhelming when considered from a place of warmth and temporary security. "So what do we do?" Celine asked finally. Clara looked around the small apartment, taking in the mismatched furniture and well-worn books, the evidence of lives rebuilt from loss and trauma through patience and daily acts of care. "I think we start by learning how to accept help without feeling like failures. Then maybe we figure out how to help ourselves." For the first time in weeks, both sisters slept through the night. The nightmare came at 3:17 a.m., announced by a scream that shattered the peaceful silence of the apartment above Ember's End Cafe. Clara bolt upright on the pull-out couch, her body drenched in sweat, her hands clutching sheets that had twisted around her legs like restraints. Beside her, Celine was already awake, automatically reaching for weapons that weren't there while her eyes swept the room for threats that existed only in shared memories. The sisters had experienced synchronized nightmares before, their twin connection extending even into the landscape of trauma where individual horrors merged into collective torment. But this one had been different, more vivid, more complete than the fragments that usually haunted their sleep. "The compound," Clara gasped, her breathing rapid and shallow. "I could see them running. All 36 of them, trying to reach the extraction point." "Dr. Martinez was in front," Celine continued, picking up the narrative thread as if they had shared the same dream. "She was carrying that little boy, the one with the broken arm. He was crying for his mother. The medical team they had failed to protect had names, faces, personal stories that made their deaths infinitely more devastating than simple casualty statistics. Dr. Alana Martinez had been a pediatric surgeon from Barcelona who volunteered with Doctors Without Borders. The little boy she'd been carrying was Ahmed, 7 years old, whose parents had been killed in the same attack that shattered his arm and left him clinging to the Spanish doctor who had become his protector. Both sisters were crying now, tears streaming down their faces as the full weight of their failure reasserted itself with merciless clarity. In the nightmare, they had watched helplessly as the medical team emerged from the compound into crossfire, believing that professional protection awaited them. Instead, they had run into a killing field with no cover, no support, no chance of survival. Footsteps on the stairs announced Elias's arrival before he appeared at the top, wearing sweatpants and an old army t-shirt that had seen better years. His hair was messed from sleep, but his eyes were alert and concerned, clearly awakened by the sound of their distress. "Nightmares?" he asked gently, settling into one of the armchairs without waiting for invitation. "The worst one yet," Clara managed, wiping her face with a tissue from the box Noah had thoughtfully placed on the coffee table. "We could see everything. Every face, every moment, every choice that led to disaster." Elias nodded with the understanding of someone who had spent countless nights wrestling with his own demons. The brain's way of trying to process trauma is to replay it until it finds a different ending. Problem is, you can't change the past no matter how many times you relive it. "But if we had been there," Selene said, her voice carrying the desperate logic of survivor's guilt. "If our transport hadn't broken down, if we had reached the perimeter in time, then maybe 36 people would be alive. Or maybe 72 people would be dead instead," Elias interrupted gently. "Trauma makes us believe we had more control over events than we actually did. It's one of the ways our minds try to make sense of senseless violence." The apartment fell quiet, except for the sound of rain that had resumed its gentle assault against the windows. Below them, the cafe sat empty and peaceful, a stark contrast to the emotional storm raging in the small space above. "Tell me about the transport," Elias said after a moment. Clara looked at her sister, then back at him. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Make, model, who maintained it, who had access, what exactly went wrong." The request was clearly professional, delivered with the tone of someone who understood that details mattered in ways that weren't always immediately obvious. Both sisters recognized the shift in his demeanor, the emergence of the investigator he had once been. "Mercedes Unimog U5000, Selene began. "Modified for desert operations, armored against small arms fire and improvised explosives. We'd used it on 12 previous missions without any significant problems, maintained by Hassan's Motors in Djibouti City. They specialize in vehicles used by NGOs and private security companies operating in the Horn of Africa region." Clara picked up the thread. "Full service 3 days before the mission, passed all diagnostic checks. Who else knew you were using that specific vehicle for that specific mission?" The sisters looked at each other, both understanding the implications of the question. Mission planning team consisted of 4 people, us, our handler Marcus Webb, and the client representative from the medical organization, plus the maintenance crew at Hassan's dispatch personnel in Djibouti, and anyone with access to our company's operational database, Selene added. Maybe 20 people total had advanced knowledge of our equipment assignments. Elias leaned forward, his expression serious. "What exactly failed on the vehicle?" "Cooling system catastrophic failure 15 kilometers from the target zone," Clara replied. "Complete loss of coolant, engine overheating, total mechanical breakdown in under 2 minutes. In a vehicle that had been operating in desert conditions for years without similar problems," Selene emphasized. Hassan himself said he'd never seen that particular failure mode in a properly maintained Unimog. "Did anyone examine the vehicle after the failure?" "By the time we could arrange recovery, it had been stripped by locals. Nothing left but the basic frame and whatever parts were too heavy to carry away." Elias was quiet for several minutes, processing information with the methodical approach of someone trained to see patterns others might miss. When he spoke again, his voice carried a certainty that sent chills down both women's spines. "Someone punctured your cooling system with a small delayed action device. Probably something designed to create a tiny leak that would worsen gradually until catastrophic failure occurred at a predetermined distance from your starting point." The implications hit both sisters like physical blows. Not only had they been sabotaged, but the sabotage had been precisely calculated to ensure they would be stranded at the worst possible moment, too far from base to return quickly, but too far from their objective to reach it in time to provide protection. "That's what we suspected," Clara said quietly. But suspecting and proving are different things. And if we're right, then someone wanted those medical workers dead badly enough to orchestrate an elaborate setup using us as unwitting instruments, Selene added, her voice hollow with the weight of realization. Which brings us to the question that's been eating at both of you, Elias said gently. Why would someone target a medical team providing humanitarian aid to displaced families? The sisters looked at each other, and in that glance, Clara saw that her twin was ready to share the information they had been holding back, the detail that made their situation far more dangerous than simple professional failure. Dr. Martinez wasn't just treating sick people, Clara said slowly. 3 weeks before the attack, she contacted our company directly, bypassing normal channels. She said she had documented evidence of systematic poisoning of water supplies in refugee camps, and that she needed secure extraction to get the evidence to international authorities. She had samples, photographs, medical records proving that someone was deliberately contaminating drinking water with compounds that cause birth defects and neurological damage in people. Selene continued. She believed it was part of a campaign to force ethnic cleansing through medical terrorism rather than direct violence. The revelation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If their suspicions were correct, 36 people had died not randomly, but specifically to prevent evidence of war crimes from reaching the outside world. And the Carter sisters had been positioned as perfect scapegoats, their reputations destroyed to discredit any future testimony they might provide. Do you know who she suspected? Elias asked. A coalition of local warlords working with international mining interests who wanted to clear the region for resource extraction, Clara replied. But she also suspected that some NGO personnel and security contractors were being paid to look the other way or actively assist in covering up the poisoning campaigns, including people in our own company, Selene added. That's why she bypassed normal channels to contact us directly. She didn't trust the usual communication protocols. Elias stood and walked to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked alley behind the cafe. When he turned back, his expression was grim but determined. You're not just dealing with professional sabotage, he said. You're witnesses to genocide who were deliberately silenced before you could testify. And whoever orchestrated this has resources, connections, and the willingness to kill dozens of innocent people to protect their operations. The apartment fell silent as the full scope of their situation became clear. They weren't just failed contractors seeking redemption. They were living evidence of war crimes whose elimination would tie up loose ends that powerful people preferred to keep buried. What do we do? Clara asked, her voice small in the face of such overwhelming corruption. Elias returned to his chair, his expression resolute. We do what soldiers do when they discover war crimes, he said simply. We document everything, we find trustworthy allies, and we make sure that truth gets told, no matter how dangerous that becomes. For the first time since Somalia, both sisters felt something other than despair, the beginning of purpose, the possibility that their failure might yet become the foundation for justice, and the hope that sometimes the people who save us are the ones who help us transform our pain into power. The rain continued to fall, but inside the small apartment, 3 veterans had begun planning a mission that could redeem more than just their own reputations. Dawn broke gray and hesitant over Millhaven, filtering through the apartment windows like an apology for the storm that had raged through the night. Clara woke to the sound of movement in the kitchen below, the familiar rhythm of someone preparing for a day that required both strength and routine. The nightmare had not returned after their conversation with Elias, and for the first time in weeks, she had slept deeply enough to dream of something other than failure and death. Selene was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a notebook balanced on her knees, writing with the focused intensity of someone organizing thoughts that had been chaotic for too long. The morning light revealed details that darkness had hidden, the deep circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly from too much caffeine and too little real rest, the military-precise way she had folded her clothes, despite having only the ones she wore. "Making lists?" Clara asked, recognizing her twin's method of processing complex problems. "Everything we know, everything we suspect, everyone who had access to information that could have been used against us." Selene held up the notebook, pages, covered with neat columns of names, dates, and connections. "If we're going to prove sabotage, we need to approach this like investigators rather than victims." The shift in language was significant. Yesterday, they had been people things had been done to. Today, they were people who could take action to uncover truth. It was a subtle transformation, but one that Elias had somehow initiated simply by listening to their story and believing their suspicions rather than dismissing them as trauma-induced. Paranoia. The smell of coffee and something sweet drifted up from the cafe below, accompanied by the sound of quiet conversation. Through the floorboards, they could hear Elias explaining something to Noah, their voices carrying the easy familiarity of people who had learned to support each other through daily routines that served as anchors in an uncertain world, he believes. U.S., Clara said, the statement carrying wonder at its novelty. Not just believes us, he's helping us see this differently. Selene set down her pen and looked at her sister. "Yesterday I was thinking about 36 people who died because we failed them. Today I'm thinking about 36 people who died because someone wanted to silence them and used us as unwitting tools." The reframing was powerful in its simplicity. Their role in the tragedy had not changed, but their understanding of that role had shifted from primary responsibility to secondary victimization. They were still connected to those deaths, but as fellow victims rather than causes. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. "Come in," Clara called. Noah appeared carrying a tray with coffee, orange juice, and what appeared to be homemade muffins still warm from the oven. "Dad thought you might be hungry. He's making eggs if you want some, but he said not to feel pressured if you're not ready for people yet." The consideration inherent in the offer touched both women. Someone was thinking about their emotional state, their need for space to process, their right to emerge from isolation at their own pace. It was a kind of care neither had experienced since leaving active duty, where personal needs were subordinated to mission requirements, and emotional processing was considered a luxury for civilians. "Tell your father we'll be down in a few minutes," Selene said. "And thank him for understanding that some mornings require coffee before conversation." Noah grinned. "He says the same thing. Mom used to say he was basically a zombie until his second cup." After he left, the sisters sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee that tasted like care and eating muffins that reminded them food could be comfort rather than just fuel. Outside, Millhaven was beginning its daily rhythm, delivery trucks rumbling down Main Street, early commuters heading to jobs that provided stability rather than adrenaline, the ordinary miracle of people going about lives that were predictable and safe. "When did we last have a morning like this?" Clara asked. "Before Somalia, before the company, maybe before we left active duty." Selene considered the question seriously. "I think we forgot that mornings could be gentle instead of tactical." Everything was tactical. Wake up, assess threats, plan routes, execute missions, debrief failures. Clara realized how exhausting their previous existence had been, even when successful. No wonder we're both running on empty. We've been living in crisis mode for years. The apartment felt different in daylight, less like a temporary shelter and more like a space where healing could occur. Books on the shelves revealed Elias's interests beyond military history, cookbooks that showed wear from actual use, novels that suggested someone who read for pleasure rather than just information, photo albums that documented the ordinary moments that constitute a life lived rather than simply survived. Clara found herself drawn to a collection of pictures on a small side table. Elias with a woman who was clearly Noah's mother, both of them laughing at some shared joke. The same woman holding a baby Noah, her face radiant with new parrot exhaustion and joy. Family photos from better times, displayed not as shrines to the past but as reminders that love persists even after loss. "He's rebuilt his life," she said, picking up a photo of all three family members at what appeared to be a local festival. Noah may be 10 years old and grinning while holding an enormous stuffed animal that probably cost more than it was worth. Not rebuilt, built differently. Selene joined her at the table, studying the images. Same foundation, same values, just adapted to new circumstances. The distinction mattered. Rebuilding suggested returning to something that had been destroyed, while building differently implied growth, evolution, the possibility that trauma could become a catalyst for something better, rather than just a wound to be healed. "Do you think we can do that?" Clara asked. "Build something different, instead of just trying to get back to what we were?" "I don't know if I want to go back to what we were," Selene admitted. Private security work was rewarding, but it was also isolating. We lived in hotels, worked with temporary teams, never stayed anywhere long enough to build real connections. Like professional nomads. Exactly. And look where it got us. When we needed help, we had nowhere to turn because we'd never invested in community. The observation was painful in its accuracy. Their entire adult lives had been built around mobility, adaptability, the ability to operate independently in hostile environments. Those skills had made them excellent contractors but poor candidates for the kind of mutual support that sustained people through genuine crises. Voices from below suggested that the cafe was beginning to fill with morning regulars. Through the floor, they could hear fragments of conversation. Someone complaining about the weather, another person asking about the daily special. The comfortable banter of people who saw each other regularly and cared about each other's well-being. In small but meaningful ways. "He has something we never built," Clara said, listening to the easy interaction between Elias and his customers. "He belongs somewhere, and people belong to him. That's why Noah is so confident, so grounded. He knows he's part of something larger than himself." The realization carried both sadness for what they had missed and hope for what might still be possible. They were 34 years old, experienced professionals with skills and knowledge that could be valuable in the right context. Nothing required them to remain isolated just because they had been living that way for years. "The investigation," Selene said suddenly. "We don't have to do it alone." Clara looked at her sister, understanding immediately. "You mean ask for help?" "I mean recognize that we're part of a community now, at least temporarily, and communities work together to solve problems." Selene gestured toward the floor, where the sound of conversation continued. "Elias has lived here for 3 years. He knows people, understands local resources, has connections we don't. The idea of accepting ongoing assistance rather than just temporary shelter was both terrifying and appealing. It meant admitting they couldn't solve everything themselves, but it also meant they no longer had to try. They could be part of something rather than just functioning independently. "We could stay long enough to figure out what comes next," Clara said carefully, testing the idea. "We could learn how to build the kind of life where morning coffee is shared instead of solitary, where problems are community challenges instead of personal burdens. We could belong somewhere." The possibility hung between them like a bridge they weren't quite ready to cross, but could finally see clearly. Outside, Millhaven continued its daily routine, offering the radical proposition that life could be ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. That safety could be chosen rather than just hoped for. That home could be found rather than just remembered. Below them, Elias called up the stairs. "No pressure, but the eggs are getting cold, and Mrs. Henderson just asked if the mysterious guests upstairs are planning to become permanent fixtures in town." Both sisters laughed, recognizing the gentle teasing of someone who understood that healing happened in community rather than isolation. For the first time since Somalia, the question was not whether they would survive, but how they would choose to live. The morning crowd at Ember's End Cafe moved with the comfortable rhythm of small-town routine. Farmers discussing weather patterns that would affect next season's crops. Teachers grabbing coffee before heading to classrooms full of teenagers who thought they knew everything. Retirees who had nowhere urgent to be, but came anyway because the cafe had become their informal community center. Clara and Celine descended the stairs into this world, carrying their notebooks and wearing clean clothes that Elias had somehow procured from somewhere. Garments that fit well enough to suggest he had developed an eye for sizing people who needed help. The conversation in the cafe paused momentarily as new faces were evaluated and categorized, but resumed quickly when Elias introduced them simply as friends staying upstairs for a while. Small towns had their own intelligence networks, and within minutes both sisters understood they were being subjected to the kind of gentle scrutiny that communities used to determine whether newcomers were worth knowing better or worth watching carefully. The evaluation felt different from military assessment or security clearance investigations. This was social rather than procedural, based on intuition rather than documentation. "Ladies," said a woman in her 60s who wore paint-stained clothing and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'm Margaret Henderson, president of the Historical Society, member of the town council, and unofficial keeper of gossip that's too interesting not to share." "Clara Novins," Clara responded, accepting the firm handshake of someone who had spent decades advocating for causes she believed in. "This is my sister Selene." "Twins," Margaret observed. "Haven't seen twins in town since the Kowalski boys graduated and moved to Seattle for those fancy tech jobs their mother still doesn't understand." The comparison was clearly meant to be welcoming, placing them in a category of people who had once been part of the community even if they were no longer present. It suggested possibility rather than permanent outsider status, the chance to belong if they chose to invest in relationships. "Elias mentioned you both served," said an older man at the counter, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had seen better decades. "Pete Morrison, Korean War, though that seems like somebody else's lifetime now." The identification was economical and effective. Military service established instant credibility, while the acknowledgement that wartime experience could feel disconnected from present reality showed understanding of how trauma could create distance between past and current identity. "We did," Selene confirmed. "Different war, but some experiences translate across generations." "They do," Pete agreed. "Though I'm hoping yours translate into staying around long enough for this town to get to know you properly." The invitation was subtle but unmistakable. Millhaven was expressing interest in having them become part of the community rather than just passing through it. The offer carried both opportunity and obligation. Acceptance would mean becoming invested in other people's lives and allowing them to become invested in yours. Elias emerged from the kitchen, carrying plates of eggs and toast, setting them down at a table that had somehow been designated as theirs without any formal arrangement. "Pete's been trying to recruit veterans for the town council for years. He thinks we bring useful skills to local government. Experience with logistics, crisis management, resource allocation under pressure," Margaret added. "Plus you're both accustomed to working as a team, which is more than I can say for some of the personalities we deal with in municipal politics." The conversation continued around them as breakfast was consumed, creating a warm bubble of inclusion that neither sister had experienced since leaving military service. People asked questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite curiosity, offered information about local opportunities and challenges, included them in discussions about community projects that needed volunteer support. "The food bank needs help with inventory management," mentioned Sarah Chen, a teacher who stopped by their table on her way to work. Current system was designed by well-meaning people who never had to track supplies under time pressure. Historical Society is trying to digitize old military records for families researching relatives who served. Margaret added, someone with experience reading operational documents would be invaluable. The offers kept coming, each one representing a way to contribute skills while building connections. Both sisters found themselves taking mental notes, surprised by how appealing the idea of useful work within a stable community had become after years of high stakes, contract positions that ended as soon as objectives were achieved. Noah appeared at their table carrying his school backpack and wearing the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone dealing with advanced mathematics before 8 a.m. Dad, can you help me with calculus tonight? The derivatives are making my brain hurt. I can help with that, Clara offered, surprising herself with the spontaneity of the response. Mathematics was my specialty before I switched to security. Work. The teenager's face lit up with relief. Really? Because I understand the concept, but the applications are killing me. Applications are where mathematics becomes useful instead of just theoretical, Selene added. Show us what you're working on, and we'll help you see the practical connections. The exchange felt natural in a way that contract negotiations and mission briefings never had. Here was a concrete way to contribute that required expertise they possessed but applied it to nurturing growth rather than managing danger. The shift from protection to development felt significant, as if they were discovering skills they hadn't realized they wanted to use. After Noah left for school and the morning crowd dispersed to their various obligations, the sisters found themselves alone with Elias in the now quiet cafe. Outside, Millhaven continued its daily rhythm, but inside the three of them sat surrounded by the comfortable debris of community interaction. Empty coffee cups, crumpled napkins, newspapers left behind for others to read. So, Elias said, refilling their coffee without being asked, what's the plan? The question carried multiple layers. Immediate plans for investigating the Somalia conspiracy, medium-term plans for their living situation, long-term plans for rebuilding their lives and careers. All three were interconnected in ways that made individual decisions affect the whole trajectory of their recovery. We want to stay, Clara said, the statement emerging before she had fully conscious decided to make it. Not just until we solve our problem, but actually stay and build something here. The investigation doesn't have to consume everything, Selene continued, picking up the thread. We can work on exposing what happened while also investing in what comes next. Elias nodded slowly, recognizing the significance of their decision. Millhaven isn't exactly a hotbed of international intrigue. You'll need to connect with resources outside town for the investigative work. But we'll have a base that's stable and supportive while we do that work, Clara replied. Somewhere to come home to when the investigation gets difficult or dangerous. Community that's invested in our success rather than just our professional output, Selene added. The distinction mattered enormously. Previous employers had valued their tactical skills and operational effectiveness, but had shown little interest in their well-being or long-term development. Here, people were offering friendship and mutual support that extended beyond any specific contribution they might make. There's something else, Clara continued, pulling out the notebook where Selene had been organizing their information. We want your help with the investigation, not just your hospitality. Elias raised an eyebrow. I'm not exactly current on international conspiracy theories, but you understand evidence collection, documentation procedures, how to build cases. That can withstand scrutiny, Selene explained. Plus you know how to navigate bureaucratic systems that don't want to hear inconvenient truths. And you're not emotionally compromised by what happened in Somalia, Clara added. You can see patterns and connections that we might miss because we're too close to the trauma. The request was both practical and symbolic. By asking Elias to become a full partner in their investigation, they were acknowledging that healing happened in relationship rather than isolation. That justice was pursued more effectively through collaboration than individual effort. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Elias said carefully. "Help us build a case that international authorities will have to take seriously," Clara replied. "Document everything in ways that can't be dismissed as trauma-induced speculation or discredited testimony from failed contractors. Find allies who can provide resources and protection while we gather evidence," Selene continued. "People who understand that exposing war crimes often puts witnesses at risk. Most importantly, help us remember that we're doing this to honor the people who died, not just to salvage our own reputations." Elias was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the implications of becoming involved in something that could bring danger to his quiet town and his teenage son. But when he spoke, his voice carried the conviction of someone who understood that some fights were worth the risks they created. "Then we better get started," he said simply. "Because if you're right about what happened in Somalia, waiting just gives the people responsible more time to cover their tracks." For the first time since the mission had gone wrong, both sisters felt something they had forgotten was possible: hope backed by community support, purpose aligned with justice, and the radical possibility that their worst failure might become the foundation for their most important success. Outside, Millhaven continued its peaceful routine, unaware that its newest residents had just committed to a mission that could change everything. 3 weeks after the sisters' arrival, the back room of Ember's End Cafe had been transformed into something that looked like a cross between a military command center and a small-town newspaper office. Maps covered one wall, marked with locations across Somalia, Djibouti, and 3 other African countries where similar medical teams had experienced equipment failures and communication breakdowns during critical missions. A timeline stretched across another wall, connecting dates, personnel changes, and contract awards in patterns that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Clara sat at a computer that Elias had somehow acquired from the high schools. Surplus equipment, her fingers flying across keys as she cross-referenced corporate records with shipping manifests and personnel files. The mathematical precision that had once calculated ballistic trajectories and infiltration routes now tracked financial flows and contract relationships with the same methodical accuracy. Selene occupied a corner table covered with printed documents, photographs, and legal pads filled with notes in 3 different handwritings. Her talent for strategic thinking had evolved from planning tactical operations to organizing evidence that could survive legal challenges and bureaucratic dismissal. The skills were transferable. Only the stakes had changed from immediate survival to long-term justice. Elias moved between the cafe and the back room, managing his business while contributing investigative skills that had been dormant since his discharge from military police work. His ability to see patterns that others missed had only improved with civilian experience, and his network of veteran contacts had proven unexpectedly valuable for gathering information that official channels preferred to keep buried. Noah had become an unofficial research assistant, his facility with technology and social media providing insights that the adults had overlooked. Teenagers, it turned out, had access to information networks that bypassed traditional security measures. And Noah's generation approached online investigation with creativity that formal training sometimes inhibited. "Found something," Clara announced, turning her screen so the others could see a shipping record highlighted in yellow. Hassan's Motors in Djibouti received a shipment of automotive cooling system components 2 days before servicing our vehicle. The shipment originated from a company in Dubai that doesn't exist anymore. Shell Company dissolved the day after the Somalia mission failed, Selene confirmed, consulting her legal pad. Same pattern we found with the communications equipment supplier and the helicopter maintenance contractor. Somebody was very thorough about covering their tracks, Elias observed, studying the timeline. But they couldn't erase everything without leaving traces of the erasure. The investigation had consumed most of their time for weeks, but it had also provided structure and purpose that allowed both sisters to engage with their trauma productively rather than just enduring it. They were still processing the loss of 36 lives, but they were doing so while working actively to ensure those deaths led to accountability, rather than just grief. The door chime announced an arrival in the front of the cafe, and Margaret Henderson's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "Elias, you back there? Town council meeting tonight, and we need to discuss the community garden proposal." "Coming," Elias called, then turned to the sisters. "You two should come tonight. Time you got involved in local government." Clara looked up from her computer. "We're not exactly residents yet. You've been here 3 weeks. You're helping Noah. With his homework, you organized a more efficient inventory system for the food bank. And half the town council has already asked when you're planning to run for office," Margaret said, appearing in the doorway with the confidence of someone accustomed to inserting herself into conversations that interested her. "Sounds like residency to me." The transition from temporary guests to community members had happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, through small acts of participation that accumulated into belonging. Clara's expertise in logistics had indeed revolutionized the food banks. Operations, reducing waste and improving distribution to families who needed assistance. Selini's strategic thinking had helped resolve a dispute about snow removal routes that had been paralyzing municipal services for months. "Besides," Margaret continued, "the community garden is partially intended as a memorial space for people who died serving others. Your input on appropriate design elements would be valuable." The suggestion carried layers of meaning. A memorial garden would provide space for honoring loss while nurturing growth, acknowledging death while celebrating life, remembering the past while investing in the future. It would also give both sisters a concrete way to channel their grief into something beautiful rather than just carrying it as burden. "We'll be there," Selini said, speaking for both of them without consultation in the way that twins could when. They were thinking harmoniously. That evening, the town council meeting revealed Millhaven's approach to governance. Informal, collaborative, focused more on practical problem solving than political positioning. The memorial garden proposal generated enthusiastic discussion about plant choices, pathway materials, and maintenance responsibilities, with community members volunteering resources and labor with the casual generosity of people who understood that public spaces belong to everyone. "The garden should include medicinal plants," Clara suggested during the discussion. "Herbs that can be used for healing as a tribute to medical workers who risk their lives helping others. And the pathways could be arranged to encourage contemplation while also providing space for community gatherings." Selini added, "Memorial spaces should serve the living as well as honoring the dead." Their contributions were received with the kind of thoughtful attention that suggested their perspectives were valued rather than just tolerated. By the end of the meeting, both sisters had been appointed to the Memorial Garden Planning Committee and asked to consider joining other town initiatives that could benefit from their organizational skills. Walking home through Millhaven's quiet streets after the meeting, Clara found herself thinking about the contrast between this evening and their previous life. 3 months ago, they had been professionals whose expertise was valued, but whose persons were largely irrelevant to their employers. Tonight, they had been community members whose opinions mattered because they were invested in outcomes that would affect everyone. "It feels different," she said to Selini as they climbed the stairs to their apartment above the cafe. "What feels different?" "Being useful because people care about us rather than just needing our skills." The distinction was profound. Contract work had provided income and professional satisfaction, but it had been essentially transactional. They provided services in exchange for payment, with minimal investment in relationships that extended beyond immediate operational requirements. Community membership required emotional investment that was reciprocated with support that extended far beyond any specific contribution they might make. "I like it," Selini said simply. I like being part of something that's trying to build rather than just protect. In their apartment, the investigation materials remained spread across tables and walls, testament to work that continued even as they built new lives around it. But the room no longer felt like a war room or a safe house. It felt like the workspace of people who had found purpose that extended beyond personal survival or professional success. The investigation was progressing steadily. They had identified patterns of sabotage affecting humanitarian operations across multiple countries, documented financial connections between various shell companies and weapons manufacturers who benefited from regional instability, and established communication with international journalists who were interested in stories about medical workers targeted for political reasons. More importantly, they had built a support system that could sustain them through whatever dangers their investigation might create. They were no longer isolated individuals trying to solve problems through pure determination and professional skill. They were community members whose work was supported by people who cared about their well-being, independent of their success or failure. "Tomorrow we call that journalist in Brussels," Clara said, reviewing their notes one final time before bed. "Tomorrow. We also help Noah with calculus and attend the planning meeting for the memorial garden," Celine reminded her. "Both matter." "Both matter," Celine agreed. Outside, Millhaven settled into nighttime quiet, a small town where people knew each other's names and invested in each other's success. Inside the apartment above Ember's End Cafe, two women who had spent years protecting others in hostile environments had learned that the greatest protection came from being known and cared for by community that was worth defending. The investigation continued, but it was no longer the only thing that gave their lives meaning. They had become full participants in something larger than professional duty or personal redemption. They had found home. The memorial garden took shape during the first warm days of spring, transforming a vacant lot beside the library into something that honored loss while celebrating the persistence of life. Clara knelt in rich soil that smelled of earth and possibility, her hands steady as she planted rosemary for remembrance alongside lavender for peace. 20 feet away, Celine worked with Noah to arrange stones that would border the meditation pathway, their quiet conversation punctuated by laughter as the teenager shared stories about his mother's legendary inability to keep houseplants alive. 6 months had passed since their arrival in Millhaven, and both sisters bore visible signs of the transformation that community belonging could create. Clara's face had lost the tight wariness that had characterized her expression during those first desperate weeks. Her shoulders no longer carried the constant tension of someone expecting attack from any direction. Celine moved with the fluid confidence of someone who slept peacefully through most nights, whose days were structured around contribution rather than survival. The investigation that had consumed their early weeks in town had reached its conclusion 3 days earlier with a phone call from Brussels that changed everything. Olena Vasquez, the investigative journalist who had spent months verifying their evidence, delivered news that felt like vindication and closure simultaneously. An international tribunal had issued warrants for 12 individuals connected to the systematic targeting of humanitarian workers in Somalia and 3 neighboring countries. The conspiracy had been larger than they had imagined, involving mining corporations, weapons manufacturers, and corrupt officials from multiple governments, who had coordinated efforts to eliminate medical teams that might document evidence of war crimes. The Carter sisters' investigation had provided the missing connections that linked individual incidents into a pattern of deliberate genocide disguised as random violence. Marcus Webb, their former handler at Meridian Security Solutions, had been arrested at his home in Virginia. The shell companies that had provided sabotaged equipment had been traced to a network of defense contractors who profited from regional instability. Most importantly, the evidence package that Dr. Martinez had died trying to deliver was finally reaching international authorities who could act on its contents. 36 people didn't die for nothing, Clara had said after ending the call with Elena, her voice steady despite tears that she no longer tried to hide. Their deaths exposed something that needed to be stopped. And now it has been stopped. Selene had replied. Because we didn't give up when everyone told us to accept blame and move on. The validation had been profound, but it was the community's response that revealed how completely their lives had changed. Margaret Henderson had organized an impromptu celebration at the cafe, not just for the investigation's success, but for the sisters' courage in pursuing truth despite personal cost. Pete Morrison had stood to offer a toast that summarized what everyone was thinking. To Clara and Selene, who reminded us that justice sometimes requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things. But it was Elias who had captured the moment's real meaning. They didn't just solve a case, he had said quietly. They showed us what it looks like to transform pain into purpose, to turn the worst thing that ever happened to you into the most important work you'll ever do. Now, 3 days later, they were literally planting roots in soil that would nourish memorial plants for decades to come. The garden's design reflected input from dozens of community members, but its heart came from the sisters' understanding of how memorial spaces should balance grief with hope, remembrance with renewal. Mom would have loved this, Noah said, pausing in his stone arrangement to survey the emerging garden. She always said the best way to honor people who died was to create something beautiful that helped the living. Clara looked up from her planting, struck by the wisdom that seemed to emerge naturally from this family that had learned to find meaning in loss rather than just enduring it. What else did she say about memorial spaces? That they should make people feel less alone, not more alone. That's why we're including the community gathering area alongside the individual reflection spots. The design was indeed intended to serve both solitary contemplation and group events. Benches positioned for privacy, shared space with an open area suitable for small gatherings, memorial services, or simply neighbors who wanted to enjoy the garden's peace together. The pathway system encouraged movement while providing alcoves for those who needed to sit quietly with their thoughts. Speaking of community gatherings, Selene said, have you decided about the dedication ceremony? The question had been under discussion for weeks. The town council had asked both sisters to speak at the garden's official dedication, scheduled for the following Sunday. The invitation represented more than just public acknowledgement of their contribution to the project. It was recognition of their transformation from traumatized outsiders to community leaders whose perspectives were valued and whose stories deserved to be heard. I think we should do it, Clara said, her hands continuing to work soil around a young sage plant. Not because we have to, but because our story might help someone else who's struggling with trauma and guilt. Plus, Selene added with a slight smile, it's time we stopped hiding from who we've become. The comment carried weight that extended beyond their specific circumstances. For months, both sisters had been rebuilding their identities from the ground up, learning to see themselves as survivors rather than failures, as community members, rather than isolated professionals, as people worthy of love and belonging rather than just useful for their tactical skills. Who have we become? Clara asked, genuinely curious about her twin's perspective. Selene considered the question while arranging stones with the precision that once characterized mission planning but now served peaceful purposes. We've become people who know that the worst things that happen to us don't have to define us. We're people who understand that healing happens in community rather than isolation. We're people who can use our experience with trauma to help others navigate their own difficult journeys. And we're people who belong somewhere, Clara added, gesturing toward the town that sprawled beyond the garden site. People who have invested in something larger than our own survival. The transformation was evident in countless small details. Clara had started teaching mathematics at the community college, her gift for making complex concepts accessible finding new expression in helping returning students rebuild their academic confidence. Selene had accepted appointment to the town's emergency management committee. Her strategic thinking skills now focused on disaster preparedness and community resilience rather than tactical operations. Both sisters had also begun volunteering with a veteran support organization that served the broader region, using their experience with trauma recovery to help other former service members navigate the transition to civilian life. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply fulfilling, providing concrete evidence that their suffering could become a source of strength for others facing similar struggles. "There's something else," Clara said, setting down her gardening tools and looking directly at her sister. "I've been thinking about what we want to say at the dedication ceremony, about what message we want to leave with people." Selene nodded, recognizing the serious tone that indicated important thoughts were about to be shared. "What are you thinking?" "I want to talk about the difference between surviving and healing. About how survival is something you can do alone, but healing requires other people. About how the communities that welcome broken people and help them rebuild are the communities that become stronger because of that choice." The message was personal but universal, specific to their experience, but applicable to anyone who had faced trauma, loss, or the challenge of rebuilding life after devastating setbacks. It was the kind of truth that could only be shared by people who had lived through the journey from isolation to belonging. "And I want to thank the people who saw potential in us when we couldn't see it in ourselves," Selene added. "Who offered help without conditions, who made space for us in their lives before we had anything to offer in return." The dedication ceremony would mark more than just the completion of a community project. It would serve as public acknowledgement that healing was possible, that transformation could occur through mutual support, that even the most broken people could become sources of strength for others, if given the opportunity to belong rather than just survive. As the sun set over Millhaven, casting long shadows across the emerging memorial garden, both sisters continued their work with the quiet satisfaction of people who had found purpose that aligned with their deepest values. Tomorrow they would continue building something beautiful from the ashes of their worst failure. Sunday they would share their story with a community that had become family, offering hope to anyone who needed to believe that even the most devastating losses could eventually lead to unexpected grace. The investigation was complete, justice had been served, and 36 people had finally received the honor they deserved. But more than that, 3 lives had been rebuilt through the radical proposition that healing happened best in community, that redemption was possible for anyone willing to accept help, and that the people who save us are often the ones who need saving themselves. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright over Millhaven, the kind of spring day that made promises about renewal feel possible rather than just wishful thinking. The memorial garden sparkled with dew on new leaves, the herbs and flowering plants that Clara and Selene had spent weeks nurturing now beginning to show the first signs of the abundance they would provide for years to come. By 10 o'clock, nearly the entire town had gathered for the dedication ceremony. Folding chairs borrowed from the church created neat rows facing a simple podium that Noah had helped his father construct from reclaimed wood. Margaret Henderson moved through the crowd with the efficiency of someone who had organized dozens of such events, ensuring that elderly residents had shade and that the coffee urn stationed on tables borrowed from the school cafeteria remained full. Clara stood at the edge of the gathering, watching faces that had become familiar over months of shared meals, town council meetings, and casual encounters at the grocery store. These people had welcomed 2 broken strangers without knowing their stories, had offered friendship before requiring explanations, had made space in their community based on intuition rather than credentials. "Nervous?" Elias asked, joining her at the periphery of the crowd. "Grateful," she replied, surprising herself with the accuracy of the word. "6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Today I'm about to speak to people who helped me discover it was actually just beginning." Selene approached from the other direction, carrying a folder that contained the notes they had prepared, but probably wouldn't need. Both sisters had discovered that the most important truths came from the heart rather than from careful preparation, that authentic sharing created connection in ways that polished presentations could not. Ready? Selene asked. Clara nodded, and together they walked toward the podium where Pete Morrison was concluding his opening remarks about the importance of memorial spaces that served both remembrance and renewal. The old veteran's words carried the authority of someone who had spent decades learning how to honor the dead while continuing to live meaningfully. And now, Pete said, turning toward the sisters, I'd like to introduce two people who have reminded all of us that healing is possible, that community matters, and that sometimes the most broken among us become the strongest voices for hope. The applause that greeted them was warm rather than polite, carrying the genuine affection of people who had watched their neighbors transform trauma into purpose, isolation into belonging, despair into determination to help others navigate similar journeys. Clara stepped to the microphone first, looking out at faces that reflected back the acceptance she had spent years believing she didn't deserve. 6 months ago, my sister and I arrived in Millhaven carrying more guilt than hope, more pain than purpose. We thought we had failed everyone who had ever trusted us. Her voice was steady, clear, reaching easily to the back rows where teenagers sat cross-legged on the grass and families balanced toddlers on their laps. What we discovered here was that failure isn't the end of the story unless we choose to stop writing new chapters. This community taught us that healing happens when broken people are welcomed rather than abandoned, when trauma becomes the foundation for wisdom rather than just the source of suffering. Selene stepped forward to share the microphone, her words building on her sister's foundation. The memorial garden we're dedicating today honors people who died serving others, but it also celebrates the truth that their deaths led to justice being served. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the catalyst for the most important work we'll ever do. The ceremony continued with music from the high school choir, readings from community members who had lost loved ones to various forms of service, and the formal blessing of a space intended to provide comfort for generations to come. But the heart of the event remained the sisters' testimony about transformation through community support, redemption through mutual care, and the possibility that anyone willing to accept help could find their way from survival to healing. As the formal program concluded and people moved through the garden to examine plants and read memorial plaques, Clara found herself surrounded by individuals who wanted to share their own stories of overcoming trauma, finding purpose after loss, rebuilding lives that had seemed permanently shattered. Your words helped me understand something about my husband's death, said an elderly woman whose eyes reflected both grief and gratitude. Maybe his sacrifice can still mean something if I use what I learned from loving him to help other military wives. Similar conversations bloomed throughout the garden as people made connections between their own experiences and the hope that the sisters had offered. This was how healing multiplied. One person's courage to share their journey became permission for others to believe their own transformation was possible. As the afternoon light began to slant through new leaves and the crowd gradually dispersed, Clara and Selene found themselves alone with Elias and Noah in the space they had helped create. The garden would serve the community for decades to come, but it had already fulfilled its most important function by providing a focal point for people to gather, remember, and commit to supporting each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. So what comes next? Noah asked, settling onto one of the benches they had positioned for optimal afternoon shade. Clara and Selene exchanged one of their wordless communications, then smiled simultaneously. Whatever the community needs, Clara said. And whatever brings us joy, Selene added. It was the perfect answer for people who had learned that purpose and happiness were not competing priorities, but complementary aspects of a life well lived. They had found their way home, not to a place, but to a way of being in the world that honored their past while embracing their future. As the sun set over Millhaven, 4 people who had become family through choice rather than blood sat in a garden, dedicated to the proposition that love persists beyond loss, that healing happens in community, and that sometimes the people who save us are the ones who needed saving themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.